Well, thank you for braving the cold and the indifference and the conservation of energy this kind of weather engenders. It is really my pleasure to introduce Michael Danilin. And it's a bit ironic that I should be doing the presentations because Michael has been associated with NYU for 10 years, to my first year. He's been here as a master's student, and then he is a teacher, teaching courses like Russia between East and West. Пожалуйста. Russia between East and West, or Russian history since 1917. He's also been teaching language courses. But Michael is much more famous in another hat he's wearing, namely that of a writer, singer, and performer, and producer for multiple music projects. Right now, as far as I know, this is Interzona, a band that Michael is leading, probably the Russian-American band best known in today's Russia. But Michael also hosts and co-produces a radio station, Rock and Dance, where he's exploring the roots and trends in contemporary music. But Michael has a third hat in which he will appear to us now, and that's as a scholar. And I really hope that his talk today, in the golden age of Russian rock in 1980s, becomes soon a dissertation and a book. Michael.
Thank you very much, Rosen, for this wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, and welcome to Jordan Center. And I really appreciate you all making here despite the cold weather. In the beginning, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the people who influenced me in doing this presentation. First and foremost, it's Irina Beladedova, who gave me this idea in the first place. And also, one of my private students, the musician and musicologist, Marisa Silverman, with whose help this idea sort of solidified in my mind. And that's worth noting how it happened. She's my elementary Russian student, and she asked for something to listen to. She's a musician, to help her, getting used to Russian language. And she likes rock and roll, so I showed her one of the bands that I will be covering today, Kino. And her reaction was very interesting. She said that she didn't see anything specifically Russian about this music, except for the lyrics. Okay, and I will stop it right there, and I will proceed to the presentation itself. So we will be talking about Russian rock today, but before we begin, let us pose the question, what is it in the first place? What does the very term mean? How should we address it today in 2016? Does it simply mean rock music made and produced in Russia? Or it means some sort of inherently different kind of music, social and cultural phenomenon with a certain distinguishable characteristics that set it completely apart from its Western counterpart. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. So those questions are some questions that I would like you to keep in your minds as you will be watching those videos and listening to me talking about these bands today. For a side observer, this question might seem idle or insignificant. However, it is only the tip of the iceberg, opening doors to much broader ideas, myths, and interpretations rooted very deeply in Russian culture and history. You can call it a conflict between East and West, and of course I'm putting it in quotes, Europe and Asia, Slavophiles and Westernizers, Or you can even go as far as calling it a conflict between globalists versus isolationists. The underlying idea, in my opinion, will still be pretty much the same. Does Russia have its own unique way, belonging to neither West nor East? Or is it a part of global society, sharing its culture, history, and it's a very socio-cultural system of values with the rest of the civilized world? There's of course more than one factor contributing to this, but if we consider the above outlook, it becomes much clearer why today some musicians will mock at the idea when somebody calls their style Russian rock, or even take it as an insult, while the others will insist that this genre, along with its unique sound, philosophy, and its very particular soulness, is the only proper one. I have to beg your pardon here as I'm about to use some censored language, but it is what it is. The popular synonym for Russian rock among representatives of various underground music subcultures today is, well, говнорок. Translated into English as shit rock, and for its stalwarts, говнари. If you read Russian and you're interested to learn more, okay, where is the switch here? So, if you read Russian and interested to learn more, here is an interesting source, website. It's called Lurk-Morie in Russian, and Lurk-More, that's how it's spelled. It's an informal Russian language media wiki-powered online encyclopedia focusing on internet subcultures, folklore, and memes. It has an article called Ruski Rock. So visit it, read it, very interesting read, and hopefully it gives you a better understanding of this conflict and how it came to such an extreme. If we consider an even broader perspective and take a look at the history and development of rock and roll or rather pop culture in general, the above-mentioned differences can be translated to the conflict between all things progressive or innovative versus purist or traditional. Moreover, we cannot escape the much larger question, what does rock and roll mean today, at the second decade of the 21st century? Does it still carry the history-changing characteristics similar to those of the 60s, 70s in the West and the 80s in Russia, or it lost them completely? Is it still some sort of cultural and social force, or all it really is today is just another established genre or genres on the colorful palette of modern pop culture? Of course, we cannot attempt to address these issues in any depth in the short course of this presentation. I just simply wanted to arm you with questions rather than give you exclusive answers. Instead of trying to find those exclusive answers, let's focus on the time of so-called golden age of Russian rock, the 1980s, when the rock music in Russia undoubtedly carried the above-mentioned history-changing characteristics of an active social force on the one hand, and the fresh music genre, or rather genres, on the other. Back then, Russian-speaking underground musicians viewed themselves as part of global music culture, trying to use whatever limited means were available to them to plant the seeds of rock and roll in the back then virgin Soviet soil. Unity is probably the best word to describe it. The above-mentioned differences did exist already in their rudimentary form, but the fundamental vector in the development of Russian rock culture was directed to the West, reflecting the sentiment prevailing in the Soviet society in general. The change was in the air, and the future, although it didn't necessarily look too particularly bright, did carry the hints of progress as opposed to reverting to the old familiar ways. And another thing, what makes it especially interesting in that sense, the word Russian, as it applies to rock, used to carry very different meaning in the 80s from now in 2016. First of all, the very term Russian rock did not exist back then. It came about only later, serving as an umbrella term for all the, protest music of the 80s in an attempt to monetize on it. Back in the 80s, being a part of Russian rock subculture was largely reflected in the popular consciousness as something new, vibrant and progressive to some, or scary and alien to the others, but fresh in any case. Back then, creating rock and roll with Russian lyrics was perceived as almost revolutionary, as nothing of the sort was thought possible before. Rock music did exist in Russia, rock movement, I would say even, in its premature marginal form from all the way back at the end of the 60s. But its for its long-haired adepts, English was the only accepted language, as Russian was thought inherently unsuitable for the vibe and groove of rock and roll. And later on, in the 80s, this idea was reflected in one of the songs of Boris Grebenshchikov, the leader of Aquarium, when he called himself an envoy of rock and roll in a rhythmic country. For the sake of the discussion, it's due to its limited time, I, by only a couple of exceptions, will try to stay aside from margins. The more radical, experimental, and avant-garde side of Russian rock on the one hand, and its more traditional side on the other. So, Siberian existential punk spearheaded by Гражданская оборона and the post-70s Машина времени and Воскресенье, influenced by classic rhythm and blues as well as Russian bard songs, will have to wait till the next moment, till the next time. And today I will concentrate on the 80s post-punk. By the very definition, the most current music coinciding with the perestroika, glasnost, and all things that brought down the Iron Curtain. So, let us throw a glimpse at that exciting time and some of its most notable representatives. The following decades took a toll on their lives, sometimes carrying them as far apart as to the different sides of barricades, quoting Mikhail Borzikin from the band Televizor. But back in the 80s, they were still together in figurative, if not the literal sense, comprising the very core of a vibrant underground youth subculture. And to continue with this line of thought, let me present you Alisa from St. Petersburg, or Leningrad back then, with the song "Мы вместе," We Are Together, performed live at the 6th Annual Leningrad Rock Club Festival in 1988.
Boys,
Alisa was formed in Leningrad in 1983 and is still active today. The song «Мы вместе» comes from the album Energia, meaning energy, recorded in 1985, and it was one of the first albums to be released by the only official recording company, state-run record label, if I can call it record label, Melodia. And how it happened, I will tell you later. As the lyrics translate, I sing for those who follow their own path. If somebody thinks the way I do will look identical, we are together. During the first years of its existence, Alisa's style was very progressive, borrowing from various current influences, from new wave and rap to heavy metal. Towards the mid-1990s, it was gradually becoming heavier, leaning more and more towards classic hard rock, the sound of Alisa ever since. One of the most popular Russian rock bands, Alisa was one of the first to break out, gaining stadium-strong audiences from the late 80s, early 90s. Its core audience is now the youth from big cities' outskirts and suburbs, proudly calling themselves the Army of Alisa, that is notorious for their rough behavior during and after the band's shows. The leader and the songwriter of the band, Konstantin Kinchev, the living personification of the famous triad sex, drugs, and rock and roll, was baptized in 1992 and became a devoted Orthodox Christian, and he's still an active propagator of Orthodox Christianity in Russia. One of the most pro-Western Russian rockers originally, both in his image and style of his music, he's now a devoted nationalist, calling for unity of Slavic peoples, and insisting that Russia belongs to neither East nor West, but needs to follow its own path. Also, he's famous by his open anti-gay stance. According to Kinchev, there is no room for tolerance here at all, and that all representatives of LGBT community need to be criminally persecuted. Such are the changes undergone by one of the most progressive Soviet rock bands of the 80s and its leader Konstantin Kinchev, whose fairly conservative religious patriotic shift is viewed unfavorably by a lot of old fans that respected Alisa for their original rock message. Still others are put off by his anti-Semitism. Among other things, he has referred to the protocols of the Elders of Zion as an official source. Alisa, nevertheless, is still one of the most popular Russian rock bands of the day. The next in our presentation is Aquarium, also from Leningrad, with the 1987 song that is now viewed as one of perestroika anthems, Train in Fire, or Поезд в огне in Russian. As one of the first lines of the song goes, we've been at war for 70 years. They taught us that life is a battle. But according to the latest intelligence data, we've been fighting against ourselves. Thank you.
Приехал на фронт со своей молодой женой. Полковник Васин созвал свой полк и сказал им: пойдем домой. Мы ведем войну уже 70 лет, нас учили, что жизнь это бой. Но по новым данным разведки мы воевали сами с собой. Генералов, они пьют и едят нашу смерть. Их дети сходят с ума от того, что им нечего больше хотеть. А земля лежит в ржавчине, церкви смешались с золой. Если мы хотим, чтобы было куда вернуться, время вернуться домой. Этот поезд в огне, и нам не на что больше жать. Этот поезд в огне, и нам некуда больше бежать. Эта земля была нашей, пока мы не увязли в борьбе. Она умрет, если будет ничьей, пора вернуть эту землю себе. Идет сбор всех погибших частей. И люди, стрелявшие в наших отцов, строят планы на наших детей. Нас сражали под звуки маршей, нас пугали тюрьмой. Но хватит ползать на брюхе, мы уже возвратились домой. Этот поезд в огне, и нам не на что больше жать. Этот поезд в огне, и нам некуда больше бежать. Эта земля была нашей, пока мы не увязли в борьбе. Она умрет, если будет ничьей, пора вернуть эту землю себе. Этот поезд в огне, и нам не на что больше жать. Этот поезд в огне, и нам некуда больше бежать. Эта земля была нашей, пока мы не увязли в борьбе. Она умрет, если будет ничьей, пора вернуть эту землю себе.
Boris Grebenshchikov, who started his band Aquarium back in 1972, is widely considered the founding father of Russian rock as we know it today. He was not the first to start writing songs with Russian lyrics, of course, but he, along with his friend and fellow rocker Mike Naumenko from Zoopark, was set to create nothing less but the new culture based on the current world music and literature. So instead of creating, or rather trying to create yet another version of the Beatles or Deep Purple, as most of the Soviet rockers did back in the 70s, he was trying to find ways to connect with the rest of civilized world, eagerly searching for information from the other side of Iron Curtain in whatever form he could obtain it, be it music, books, films, videos, personal connections. He, along with his brothers in arms, was consciously working on creating Soviet pop culture that was to become a part of global pop culture, based on similar experiences and having same influences. From the very beginning, he realized that song lyrics was the only tool readily available to him, given the lack of sufficient equipment and music instruments of decent quality. So he set out to create a Russian rock and roll poetic language, thus paving the way for the entire new generation of musicians. Finally, along with his friend, sound engineer, producer, and rock enthusiast Andrei Tropila, they created a new trend of magnetic albums, or tape albums, recording real studio albums as opposed to live bootlegs of Aquarium and other Leningrad-based bands, and distributing them through the underground channels based on word of mouth. Let's dwell on this for a moment. Many of you have probably heard, many of you are probably familiar with the samizdat. You know, the self-publishing of prohibited or simply unpublished texts, the Soviet phenomenon dating back at least as 1960s. Some of you are probably familiar with magnetizdat, recording live bootlegs of amateur performance, mostly bards. The phenomenon that also dates back to the 1960s, when first reel-to-reel recorders became available to Soviet consumers. Well, we can view this new trend of magnetic albums, originated by Tropila along with Grebenshikov, as a continuation of magnetizdat. However, there is a very important a difference. Magnetальбомы were real concept albums recorded and produced in the studio, as opposed to bootleg concert recordings. Each part of this process, from properly recording and mixing to creating an album cover, was a well thought out process and it required a lot of effort. Especially given that musicians and producers had to work with very limited means, both in terms of instruments and equipment. The now legendary recording studio Antrop Records was an illegal enterprise, functioning from one of Leningrad's young pioneer centers, where Tropila ran a sound recording club for youth. Later on, Andrei Tropila worked his way up to becoming a director of a Leningrad branch of Melodia, that only record company existing in the USSR, state-run virm that I already mentioned. And when he became a director, it resulted in officially releasing now as vinyl records, the albums by the likes of Aquarium, Kino, Alisa, and many others recorded and produced at his studio. But back to Aquarium. The band is still active today and it's still very popular. Even though Boris Grebenshikov always made it a point to stay aside from politics, he is well known by his criticism of the latest developments, such as Russia supporting the war in Ukraine and actively participating in it. He is one of the very few Russian musicians having toured in Ukraine since 2013. Last summer, he became the center of scandal when his photo with the mayor of Odessa, Mikhail Saakashvili, ex-president of Georgia, was widely criticized by the Russian officials. For example, the member of Defense Committee of Gosduma, the Russian parliament, Alexander Zhuravlev, called Grebenshikov a traitor and said that he is now officially dead for his fans. Lastly, during the same tour, Boris Grebenshikov, who himself is a devoted Christian, made a statement at one of the concerts condemning the Russian Orthodox Church officials for taking part in state affairs and supporting aggression such as the war in Ukraine. Coming up next is arguably the best and, well, at least one of the most influential Russian rock bands, Kino, also from Leningrad, with another song that is now considered perestroika anthem. The name of the song is "Хочу перемен," which translates as "I want change." As chorus goes, our hearts demand change, our eyes demand change, it's in our laughter, our tears, the pulse in our veins. Change, we're waiting for a change. This video features the closing scene of the film Assa that came out in 1987, the very first one to feature Russian rock music, and the very moment when Kino, already an established underground act, broke out to the mainstream. the band, Viktor Tsoi, was always very skeptical towards using this song in the context of political changes happening in the USSR. And towards using songs of Kino in general in any kind of political context. For example, after the song War was used in a documentary on the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, he made it a promise not to ever deal with television ever again. And this promise was kept by him, resulting in a very limited amount of video materials, despite of the band's huge popularity. His songs, according to himself, are about freedom, as in one's inner freedom, making him or her independent of ever-changing circumstances. And they're also about the importance of preserving oneself as opposed to satisfying a certain image or fitting a certain criteria imposed by the others. Back in 1981, when Kino was founded, their style was a combination of the early 80s neo-romanticism and the beat music of the 1960s. However, starting with around 1984 and on, they were leaning more and more towards new wave, especially its colder and darker side, which trend continued until Tsoi's tragic death in a car accident in 1990, on the very peak of his band's popularity. Arguably the very first Russian album that was a Western by its quality, both in terms of musicianship and production, and being very current at the time, Grupa Krovi, Blood Type, was released in the West and gained the band a lot of respect and positive feedback from the likes of British New Wavers, New Order, American Brazzaville, who made a cover of one of Kino's songs, and one of the most famous DJs in the world, Paul Oakenfold, who remixed this song, Хочу перемен. Even though the band stopped existing when Tsoi died in 1990, its legacy continues to this day, gaining more and more new fans, some of which weren't even born yet when Tsoi died. The minimalistic, almost sparse, to-the-point approach that the band used both in their music and their lyrics was in perfect accord with what was going on in the world pop culture in general at the second half of the 1980s, making their songs easily accessible by millions on the one hand, and containing all the important elements, making them current rock music of world-class quality on the other. To conclude the part about Kino, here's an interesting story that came up a couple of years ago, having to do with Viktor Tsoi and his legacy. A deputy of Gosduma, the lawmaker Evgeny Fedorov, made a statement that the CIA funded and assisted Tsoi and Kino in hopes of, destroying the Soviet state. That's what he said. Professionals in Hollywood wrote songs in Russian. And it was, once again, it was Evgeny Fedorov, a government advisor and one of the founders of United Russia Party. Our KGB carried out investigations and got this information. There were thousands of such projects. So according to Fedorov, this very song, I Won't Change, was written for Tsoi by the CIA operatives. Well, one of the best responses to these allegations was the line from Tsoi's own song Muraveinik, posted by one of his fans as a comment. I don't know what percentage is crazy right now, but if you trust your eyes and ears, it's a lot more than before. Tsoi's son Alexander filed a legal complaint against Fedorov, accusing him of slander, but I have no knowledge of further development of this story. The next in our presentation is Televizor, another band from Leningrad, with the song with the telltale title Syt po gorla, fed up to the neck. That's how the lyrics go. They would stuff me up to the neck, but don't eat if you don't like it. One of the benefits is that you can beg all you want still. That is all that you're ever going to get. It's pointless to think of what's to come. If you're weak, you weren't properly fed. There's nothing for me to ask for. I'm certain that I'm satiated. I'm full. I'm fed up to the neck.
Доброе утро! Я снова здесь, ничего не надо у меня. Я гуляю по кухням, с крутым видом и имею основание считать себя цивилизацией. Это не голодный, чего у меня нет. Да все, что угодно, открываю холодильник и мозгами глубоко. Я чувствую уверенность в том, что я цивилизация. Только не проси, другого не получишь и не стоит думать о том, что дальше. Если ты плохо, ты ел мало каши, мне нечего желать и нечего просить. Я тебя убежден в том, что я цивилизация. Свет по городу, лай-лай-лай-лай. Свет по городу, ла-ла-ла-ла-ла-ла-ла. Работай головой, ранишь желудка, берешь любую тему, происходишь глоток и превращаешь информацию в желудочный сахар. Я уничтожил столько добра, мой холодильник не даст собрать, но иногда бывает плохо. Никаких обид, никаких сомнений. Да, я никаких претензий, никаких обид, никаких сомнений. Да,
Televizor was formed in Leningrad in 1984. Its style is not easily definable as it borrows from various current influences, but it has always been leaning to new wave, especially its darker electronic side. However, before I start discussing Televizor, it is probably time to shed some light on why so many Russian rock bands of the 80s are from Leningrad. The Leningrad Rock Club was a historic music venue of the 1980s, situated on Rubinstein Street in the city center. Opened in 1981 and overseen by the KGB, it became the first legal rock music venue in Leningrad and in the USSR in general. Overall, it was the largest rock scene in the Soviet Union, and the only place where such bands as Televizor or Aquarium, Kino, and many others were allowed to perform without any repercussions. In order to receive a permission to perform, though, each band needed to submit their lyrics for the approval by the club's committee. Well, the goal was to keep the youth culture in check to prevent its more controversial manifestations. However, by giving musicians the place to meet, perform, and discuss their music, the club provided for an unprecedented amount of creative freedom and helped lead to the Russian rock revolution, if I can say that. The club effectively closed in 1991. So, in 1986, when preparing for their performance at the next festival of Leningrad Rock Club, Televizor submitted the song lyrics to the committee, and some of these lyrics were not approved. Nevertheless, Borzikin decided to perform the controversial songs, resulting in him and Televizor being dismembered from the rock club, and their performances being banned until 1987. This story illustrates the position that Mikhail Borzikin has always kept unchangeably. His uncompromising, oftentimes radical words and actions have cost him a great deal. Unlike many of his fellow rockers from the same era, he never became a part of the mainstream, effectively returning back to underground after the initial wave of interest towards rock and its protest was inevitably washed out by the countless new commercial pop projects. As his colleagues are still monetizing on their legendary status earned during the years of Perestroika, when rock was the officially proclaimed music of protest, Televizor and Borzikin, the very essence of protest in any imaginable form, has now only a limited club popularity. Borzikin's bitter lyricism condemning on all kinds of ugliness in human nature, his openly aggressive stance towards music producers and managers of all sorts, and his unwillingness to compromise even the slightest bit for the sake of being more successful commercially, resulted in him being almost forgotten comparing to such grandees of Russian rock as Kino, Alisa, and DDT. His equals in fame back at the end of the 80s. And of course, the active part that he takes in the anti-Putin opposition doesn't help that either. Revered by some, condemned by many, he, in my opinion, is the very personification of the idea of staying true to oneself, both in his music and his life in general. Televizor has recently completed a successful crowdfunding campaign to release a new album, which goal was 600,000 rubles, a little over $9,000. As the official message from the band goes, with the current political, economic, and spiritual situation of the country, it is sometimes hard to escape the feeling of futility of creative efforts. We are willing and ready to make a new album, but we need proof that it's not in vain and that you need it too. Well, fortunately, the band got their proof, and the new Televizor album is now in the works. But it's time to move to Moscow. Unlike Leningrad, capital city of the Soviet Union, was far from being the center of free creative expression. Underground rock musicians and artists maintained illegal status, and there were cases of criminal persecution and even imprisonment of rockers and promoters for taking part in illegal concerts, when fighting illegal commercial activity was declared as an official reason for such punitive measures. However, the wave of changes was already unstoppable. The interest towards rock music grew, along with the number of new bands, and finally in 1985, Moscow authorities decided to follow the example of Leningrad and establish Moscow Rock Laboratory in an attempt to keep the sporadic underground concert activity in check. One of the flagships of Moscow Rock Lab was, of course, Zvuki Mu, which name could be described as a game of associations. Zvuki means sounds in Russian, and Mu can be interpreted as first two letters of the word music, or moo, as in cow mooing. The band was formed in 1983 by poet, songwriter, and translator from Scandinavian languages, Pyotr Mamonov, who was known in Moscow underground circles as a formidable dancer and a person with the oftentimes shocking behavior. It is very hard to describe the style and sound of Zvuki Mu, and the best I can come up with here is loosely compared to the no wave movement, music and video movement of New York City of the late 1970s, early 80s. The band members themselves define their style as a Russian folk hallucination, русская народная галлюцинация. A famous music critic, Artemy Troitsky, a close friend of Mamonov who played violin in one of the early band's lineups, once said that Zvuki Mu conveys the very essence of Russian psychedelia, that was based not on psychedelic substances as we know them, but on excessive amounts of alcohol, resulting in белая горячка, or delirium tremens. According to Brian Eno, a famous British musician and producer, having played with Roxy Music and having worked with the U2 and Talking Heads, among others, when he first saw Pyotr Mamonov on stage, it felt like this man was simply possessed. This shocking performance, contrasting with the band's sparse and cold experimental sound, led Ina to choosing Zvuki Mu as the Russian band to work with and producing their self-titled album. That story is full of legends. I will quickly recount one of them. When Zvuki Mu were in London, they stayed over Brian Eno's house. The house had a studio. At some point, Brian Eno needed to leave for several hours to take care of some things, and he was hoping that in the several hours the band would come up with some interesting ideas to work on later. So when he came back, as the legend goes, he found the band completely wasted, and his stack of collectible wines, very expensive ones, in the basement significantly diminished. Needless to say, Brian Eno was not too happy about it, and maybe that was the reason of why that project, that album, was the only one they collaborated on. Okay, now let me present you the performance of Zvuki Mu at Music Ring TV show in 1989, probably the only appearance of the band on television. Use your best judgment.
Му-стиль. Законодателями этого стиля и пока он в звуке уважать какой группы.
probably the only appearance of Zvuki Mu on Soviet television, and the performance was followed by questions from the audience. One person wanted to know whether Mamonov was seen by a psychiatrist. Another one asked who Mamonov thought was more crazy, himself or the people who came to see his show. And to that Mamonov replied that he, of course, was more insane, and he thanked God for that. There's no such word as "godopyatikna" in a Russian language, and the closest I can come to understanding its meaning is something extremely, extremely awful. As the song lyrics go, from the bison's eyes the darkness ignited, from the bison's eyes the darkness ignited, and something so awful now dwells in my house. Zvuki Mu was always centered around Mamonov's pantomimic, shocking stage act. He often said that by his songs he wanted to show people how not to live. By around 1995, he became a devoted Christian and officially parted with his rock and roll legacy, which he now condemns as bestial way of life. Currently, he is mainly active as an actor. His most important roles are a repentant hermit in The Island and Ivan the Terrible in Tsar, both directed by Pavel Lungin. However, he still releases albums in experimental style that can be described as a combination of spoken word with music. And they are often labeled as Zvuki Mu, even when Pyotr Mamonov is a sole participant. He also makes one-actor theatrical plays combining pantomime, music, and stream of consciousness philosophical observations. Last spring, he announced the new incarnation of Zvuki Mu, now titled Совершенно новые Zvuki Mu, the brand new Zvuki Mu, following the same experimental approach as Mamonov used in his solo projects. Finally, there's something I absolutely need to mention despite the lack of time, even though it lies beyond the scope of this presentation. We're very used to the idea of Western bands influencing their Russian counterparts, sometimes to the point that Russian rockers intentionally or unintentionally copy their Western colleagues in music, stage performance, outfit, hairstyle, video concept, etc. Well, here's an example of this process working in reverse. In 2013, American indie rock band The National released a video to the song Sea of Love, which, according to themselves and all official sources, was based on Zvuki Mu's video Грубый закат, the rough dusk, released in the early 90s. If you check these two videos, they look practically identical to the very last detail, a very rare example of Western musicians finding their influences in Russia. Okay, let's move on. The next in our presentation is another band from Moscow, Tsentr. In Russian is pronounced Tsentr, with their song Навсегда, translated as Forever, also performed at the Music Ring TV show in the late 1990s.
Калашников, Винтиков, Вспомним бабушек, вспомним дедушек, красивых с заветными парнями и девушками. Навсегда, все наше, навсегда, 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 все наше, навсегда, навсегда, навсегда. Все наше навсегда, навсегда, навсегда. Все наше навсегда.
Okay, as you just heard, the song lyrics are essentially the list of various Russian archetypes, from Matryoshka and Balalaika to Pushkin and Kalashnikov, with a chorus that translates as "Let's remember our grandmothers, let's remember our grandfathers, let's compare them to the modern youth, all that's ours forever." It's interesting that slogan, that line "Все наше навсегда." It's interesting how later on, towards the end of the 90s, it became a slogan of Nasha Radio, the newly established Russian rock station, without the slightest hint to irony. Well, after this performance, one of the people from the audience asked the band what exactly they saw as a goal of this song, and in what way they imagined it was supposed to move a listener. With a very straight, emotionless face, a trademark of his image, Vasily Shumov, the leader of the band, said that the song "Forever," as well as all other songs by Tsentr, have only one single purpose: teaching Russian language to foreigners. Formed in the late 70s, Tsentr, along with Zvuki Mu, Brava, and Brigada S, was one of the most popular bands in Moscow underground. Very eclectic and experimental, their music has always been based on edgier, more avant-garde type of new wave. Shumov's lyrical style is very unique, ranging from singing to melodic declamation, and even spoken word. It's dripping with morbid humor and cold, sarcastic observations. Russian music journalist Grigory Knyazyev goes as far as calling Shumov the third main misanthrope of Russian rock, after Borzikin from Televizor and Mamonov from Zvuki Mu. Skillful sound engineer and producer, he helped the other Moscow rockers to record and produce their albums. One of the examples being Zvuki Mu's first official release, "Простые вещи," Simple Things. In the early 90s, Shumov moved to California, where he studied multimedia, video, and new music technologies. Throughout 90s, 2000s, he released a number of solo albums, influenced by various genres of electronic music, and did a number of performances with various guest musicians. In 2008, he moved back to Russia, reformed Tsentr, and launched a new production project, "Содержание," meaning substance, which goal is to bring substance to pop culture that has been carried away by playing with form. As part of this project, a number of compilations of like-minded artists was released, both in physical and digital form. And let me do some shameless promotion here. My band Interzona participates in 5 of such compilations. Aside from music, Shumov produces videos and short experimental films in noir style. He's an active lecturer, speaking on music and arts, culture and history, and his ideas are oftentimes unorthodox, to say the least. Finally, it's worth noting that just like Mikhail Borzikin from the band Televizor, he takes active part in anti-Kremlin protest movement. The next one in our presentation is Brava, one of the most popular Moscow bands that was formed in 1983 and is still active today. On the wave of revival, classic, early classic rock and roll of the 1950s and rockabilly that was surfacing in the West in the late 70s, early 80s. The leader of Brava, guitarist and songwriter Evgeny Khaftan, decided to combine his 1950s Western influences with the Soviet legacy dating back to the same era. The first vocalist of the band was Zhanna Aguzarova, a showwoman whose eccentric, on the verge of shocking stage presence, kitschy outfits and makeups combined with unique vocal style were very instrumental in making Brava an instant legend. Actually, one more thing that's worth noting, Aguzarova has always insisted that she was born on Mars and that she's going back there eventually. In 1984, as Moscow authorities were working very hard to suppress the underground concert activity, Aguzarova was arrested during the band's show and had to spend 1.5 years in jail. When she came back to Moscow, she resumed working with Brava and stayed in the band until 1988, when she decided to follow her own creative pursuits. In 1991, she moved to California, where she worked as a singer in a Russian restaurant, a DJ, and even a limo driver. While in LA, she recorded 2 albums with Vasily Shumov from Tsentr, who also lived in LA at that time. Aguzarova returned to Russia in 1996, did several reunion shows with Brava, and currently she performs solo, mostly doing club gigs. So let me present you the song Leningradsky Rock and Roll, Leningrad Rock and Roll, recorded in 1986, a Russian homage to the classic dance rock and roll of the 1950s. As the lyrics translate, from Moscow to Leningrad and back to Moscow again, power lines, fences, and bridges are dancing. Burning hearts, hear me out, dance to the Leningrad rock and roll. when Aguzarova left the band in 1988, Brava steadily declined in popularity. However, Kaftan and his colleagues didn't give up. They kept trying different vocalists, both male and female, and managed to regain the momentum. First in the mid-90s with Valery Syutkin, and later in the late 90s, early 2000s with Robert Lenz. And they have stayed one of the most popular Russian rock bands ever since. Their songs about love, partying, and the beauty of Moscow streets, very notable by self-irony and melodicism, have always felt nostalgic and fresh at the same time. Setting Brava well aside from all the pathos and protest of the Soviet rock of the 1980s, the gloom of the early 90s, and the new radio-friendly Russian pop rock of the late 90s, early 2000s. Next comes another band from Moscow, formed in 1984, Brigada S. Self-described as a proletarian jazz orchestra, оркестр пролетарского джаза, the band's style was an eclectic mix of a classic 1950s rock and roll, rhythm and blues, and even a reggae, with elements of jazz marked by the effective use of brass section. Founded and fronted by an eccentric singer and showman Garrik Sukhachov, Brigada S was one of the most popular bands in Moscow rock lab. Between 1984 and 1993, when the band stopped existing, they released 5 studio albums, made a film appearance, and toured the United States in 1988. Garrik Sukhachov, who made after the band split in 1993, the band members followed their own creative pursuits. Garrik Sukhachov, who made the first appearance as an actor in 1998, participated in 20 films and shot 3 more himself as a director. In 1999, Sukhachov published his first book, The King of the Boulevard, Король проспекта, followed by Where the Rain Ends, где кончается дождь, in 2001. From 1994 until present, Sukhachov is a frontman of Неприкасаемые, The Untouchables, the band whose style can be probably described as a Russian rock proper, as we know it today, based on rhythm and blues on one hand and Russian chanson, or street folk, if you will, on the other. But back to Brigada S. Let's watch them playing one of their hits, Бродяга, translating as hobo, at a rock festival in 1987. What a strange card suit. What a daring vocation. This is a city of slumber, the refuge of fools and streets with no names. Oh, save me, my homeless nature. This is loosely how the song lyrics go.
Я вам
я так же, как и жилось. Я сам себе и враг, и друг. Я сам себе порог и сам порочный круг. Бродяга, какая странная масть. Бродяга, какое дерзкое призвание. Но город сна, прибежище глупцов и улиц без названия. Бродяга, это слово брод. Бродяга, но я не знаю брода. Я попадаю в поворот. Спаси меня, моя природа.
In 1989, Sukachov co-organized the festival Rock Against Terror, which featured a speech, one of the first in the Soviet Union, in the defense of sexual minorities' rights. I would be very interested to know what Sukachov has to say on the subject today, in 2016, when the official position of Russian authorities towards representatives of LGBT community and the sentiment prevailing in the Russian society is far from being favorable, to say the least. However, I have no knowledge of his current opinion on the subject. What I do know, though, is that, according to him, Sukachov is a devoted Orthodox Christian, very supportive of the current religious and patriotic revival in Russia. During one of his TV interviews last year, he expressed pity for his fellow rockers Andrei Makarevich from Mashina Vremeni and Diana Arbeina from Nachные Snipery, who openly spoke against Russia's involvement in Ukraine. According to Sukachov, they both made a tragic mistake which caused them respect of their fans. And it's probably worth noting how Andrei Makarevich responded to this. He did it through Facebook post, where he said that the post theme was respect. He was playing with this idea of respect, and then he said that what interests himself the most, Makarevich, is the respect of the people whom he himself respects in turn. And he definitely did not lose the respect of those. But the most important thing, even more important, Makarevich said, is self-respect. And not to lose the self-respect is the most important thing in your life. And that's what he wished Sukachov. Okay, now let us travel to Sverdlovsk. Now it's called Yekaterinburg. An industrial center of Western Siberia, the fourth largest city in Russia. It was widely considered the third Russian rock capital after Leningrad and Moscow. Rock movement existed there since at least the late 70s, and there was a number of critically acclaimed Sverdlovsk bands. One of them was Agatha Christie, formed by brothers Vadim and Gleb Samoilov in the late 1987. According to Gleb, in the beginning the band's main tendencies were based on 1970s art rock and rock and roll, yet the lyrics represented the early 80s decadence punk rock movement. At the late 80s, Agatha Christie was an established underground act already making its first TV appearances. However, their mainstream popularity did not come until early to mid-1990s, when they started leaning towards dark wave and gothic side of post-punk, making songs marked by more minimalistic arrangements and heavy use of synthesizers. According to some critics, Agatha Christie are one of the very few pioneers of Russian rock who managed to elaborate their early post-punk influences to the current music of 1990s, 2000s. After staying active for 22 years, Agatha Christie officially disbanded in 2010. According to press, one of the reasons of the band splitting were the different political views the brothers Samoilov now hold. Vadim, that's him, is a close friend of Vladislav Surkov, one of the leading Russian state authorities, the official aide of a Russian president. And he was Putin's confidant during his re-election in 2012. While Gleb is well known for his active support of radical opposition. Today, brothers Samoilov follow their own creative pursuits, and each of them plays solo concerts performing greatest hits of Agatha Christie. Next Saturday, on February 20th, Gleb Samoilov is coming to New York, where he is going to perform the biggest hits of Agatha Christie, backed by his friends from the punk rock band Naive, as part of their North American tour. They're going to perform in the Music Hall of Williamsburg, and another piece of shameless self-promotion, the last one for today, is my band Interzone is also participating. Okay, let's check out the song Afrikanka, the African female, performed live at the festival in 1988. The song lyrics are very abstract, suggesting sexuality and decadent beauty. Somehow they are reminiscent of both the Silver Age poetry, in my personal opinion, and the Soviet films about World War II, especially given that the song chorus is sung in German.
Умеет владеть ситуацией, права и всесильна одна, горда африканской формацией. Африканку тревожит луна, но дрожит перед ней исполкома стена. Тогда потрясает она своей сексуальной дотацией. Я-я-я, натюрморт, капюшон, югендрау. Я-я-я, натюрморт, meine kleine Frau. Привычные, понятные, простые слова африканской полемики. И радость кушают отцы, и дым фаршируют коллеги. Значит, есть под луной красота, не втоптать красоту преснотой никогда. И тут совета вода споет в восхищенной истерике. Я-я-я, натюрморт, капюшон, югендрау. Я-я-я, натюрморт, meine kleine Frau.
as I mentioned before, mainstream popularity, mainstream fame will only come to Agatha Christie later, in the early to mid-1990s. However, it was another band that made Sverdlovsk a rock capital, the third one after Leningrad and Moscow, as early as 1987, Nautilus Pompilius. Formed by students of Institute of Architecture, Vyacheslav Butусов and Dmitry Umetsky, in 1983. The band started experimenting with the various new wave, with the various post-punk and new wave influences, which eventually led to creating their own sound, called and melodic new wave based on keyboards and saxophone arrangements. It felt very current at that time. Along with Butусов and Umetsky, there was a third person responsible for Nautilus's success and long-lasting fame, a poet, Ilya Karmiltsev, no longer living, unfortunately, who wrote most of the song's lyrics and who played major part in creating the band's ideology. Karmiltsev's lyrics, poetic philosophical observations, oftentimes based on darker sides of reality, fit perfectly well with the band's dark and static image, and called melodicism of their music. At the late 1980s, on the wave of growing interest towards rock, along with the Aquarium, Kino, Alisa, DDT, and some others, Nautilus achieved mainstream fame, making multiple TV appearances and playing for thousands strong audiences. In the early 1990s, Butусов moved to St. Petersburg, and he has been living there ever since. After disbanding Nautilus in 1997, he released several solo albums, and in 2001, along with Georgy Kasparyan, the ex-guitarist of Kino, they formed a new band called Jupiter to perform Butусov's new material as well as legendary hits by Nautilus and some selected songs from Kino legacy. The band is active to this date, and according to some rumors, they are coming to play in New York in April. So, to conclude this presentation, let me now play for you the song Farewell Letter, Прощальное письмо, also known as Goodbye America. As the song lyrics go, I grew out of your washed jeans. It took them so long to teach us to love your forbidden fruits. Goodbye, America, where I will never ever be. Will I ever hear the song that I will remember forever? Written by Butусов with the help of Umetsky, the song became a major hit instantly. According to Butусов, the song's mood was parting with the childhood, playing with an idea of mythical, unreachable America lying somewhere far beyond the Iron Curtain. In the year 2000, it appeared in Brother 2, the sequel of Alexei Balabanov's Brother film, where it was performed by children's choir. According to some critics, it symbolized the new Russian trend already surfacing in the late 90s. Growing national self-awareness in light of a disillusionment with American dream. And that is the recording that was recorded live in 1988 during one of the band's shows.
Goodbye, America. прощай навсегда. Возьми банджо, сыграй мне на прощание. Твои тёртые джинсы нас так долго учили любить твои запретные плоды. Goodbye, Америка, где я не буду никогда услышу ли песню, которую запомню навсегда.
Okay, that was all I wanted to cover today, and now it's probably a good time for some questions, if you have any.
Thank you for this really education, at least for me it has been from musical education. There was a distinct motif in your brief portraits of many of these groups. He did so and so, and then he became baptized and made these such and such pronouncements about Krinash. And granted that right now many cultural producers start being lined up to make such pronouncements, but it seems to me that with rock, this tendency towards from radical protest to some form of conservatism became much earlier than with other cultural fields, and I was just wondering about your ideas why this may be so, why this turn to reaction.
It's an interesting question. Well, first of all, let me correct you a little bit. To the best of my knowledge, none of the people I talked about today actually said criminage, you know. Some of them do belong to radical opposition though, and the others are, I would say, the reasons are they're just conforming to what is going on in Russia today, because the 80s made them legends, and now they're living a pretty decent lifestyle, thanks to that. A lot of them, at least, getting like really big audiences, making a lot of money. And each of them does realize that should they say something opposing the official government course, they can easily lose it, or at least significantly lose a significant portion of it. We all know what happened to Mashina Времени, the hugely popular Russian band who used to perform at a Red Square. And at some point, Andrei Makarevich was even seen sharing this VIP lodge with Putin at some events. And yet, Andrei Makarevich stepped out and he said he spoke against the Russian involvement in Ukraine. And there are no concerts of Mashina Времени taking place in Russia today. So that was that I would probably say is the reason why. And as of why they were the first ones, why did it happen to them before some others? I don't know. It's a good point for consideration, like further thinking about this all. But my theory is that Russian rock was fairly young phenomenon. It was only developing, and the musicians didn't have enough time to how would I say accumulate this. Not knowledge, but the skills to resist the official course of Russian politics today. And back in the 80s, especially at the second half of the 80s, in a sense, it was not too difficult to be a Protestant because it was in the air. It was basically a trend, more or less. Not to say that they were not, they didn't have any problems. A lot of their shows were banned or even busted by the police or even KGB at some point. Some of them were called to KGB, had to answer questions, things like that. But overall, it was considered a more or less normal thing at the end of the 80s. The trend was the opposition. And now the trend has changed. And it became, a test to a lot of rockers. Now we can kind of see who is who. The ones who kept their position, and the ones who, changed it. If that answers your question.
We have watched a lot of videos here, both from early 80s and from late 80s, and many of them were very elaborate, and I would feel that they were made for television. Pushing this content through on the television, on the TV screen, imposes some sort of another process of control over the content of these videos. So my sort of a question was, how were they made? With what intention were they made? Would you feel that they went on TV, which by that time, was a very sort of powerful information source in that setting? Yes, were they somehow allowed to reach the viewers because of some sort of inherent cultural value that might have been seen in them, or whether this was sort of a means of promotion that actually turned them into legends? How would you feel about this thing?
Thank you for your question. Music videos was a recently new phenomenon, not only in Russia, but in the world in general, back in the 80s. I think with the advent of MTV, they started appearing in the 80s, the first videos of Duran Duran, for instance, and other bands, Jackson. And that videos were made in approximately the same time. With what goal, and did they hope to reach wider audiences through television? Well, some of those videos, live performances, had taken place on TV. There was this Russian Soviet show, Music Ring, and some of them were shot at Music Ring. It was the show when they would take 2 or more bands and made them fight musically, and then the people in the audience would vote and would express their ideas. So yeah, that was a TV project to begin with. As of, well, some of them were recorded live, and those are just live videos. I have no knowledge whether they were ever shown. Well, Nautilus's video definitely was shown because you could see a Nostalgia channel logo there. And as of Televizor, for instance, I don't know. And as of Brava, I don't know too. Those were music videos. Did they hope that they would ever show them on TV? They probably did, because it was an effort back then to film a video in the first place. And probably they did have some connections, and they saw some opportunities to make them, you know, shown on TV.
To answer your question partly, most of these videos take place in the late 80s, which is perestroika going full throttle. And the Music Ring was basically one of the first attempts to introduce rock music to Russian television, which was, I believe, in 1985. Started 86, and it was a smashing success. And TV quickly realized that the rock music was in demand, and as such, it was easier for rock bands to make it to television first. Aquarium was probably the trailblazer, and that was followed by Bravo, which was introduced at some point by Alla Pugacheva, the Russian megastar, and then followed by Kino and Nautilus and others. So at that time, that was, as Mike said, it was hot stuff and trend and all that. Oh, sorry. My question. Oh,
Thank you.
Sorry. My question to you, Mike, was something I was thinking long and hard about is where are the new stars? And why isn't there, basically, I believe it's also, I mean, this question can be posed to American rock music, English rock music as well. Why there are no acts that can measure up to Led Zeppelins and Deep Purples of old. And probably the last real rock, well, I'm using the word rock musician as loosely as I can, was probably Eminem. Because after him, there was really nobody that would stack up, that would really smash the walls and lead the masks. But to stay on subject, other than Noise MC, I can't go, there are no new Shevchuks and Butusovs, and why?
Well, thank you very much for this question. Of course, don't expect me to answer it, because this is something that keeps me, you know, thinking for God knows how many years. And probably when I do write my dissertation, I will try to examine that there as well. But my opinion is that, strangely enough, today there is no demand for this kind of creativity, neither in the West nor in Russia. Things tend to take extreme forms in Russia and maybe become even more pronounced a little bit. But in my opinion, that's the reason. That's the main reason. There is no demand. People, apparently for some reason which is not clear to me, as of yet, people don't need it. That's why they don't exist. That said, there are very good musicians, both in the West and in Russia. And there are plenty of them, definitely not any less than there were in 1980s. Noise MC is one. I would also name Tequila Jazz, for instance, and the new project of Evgeny Fedorov, Zorgi. Mark Scheider Kunz, the band from St. Petersburg. Well, we cannot forget Leningrad. And those of you who went to see their show about a month ago at Hammerstein Ballroom saw how they made the place completely packed. Well, Leningrad is a special case. Their rock is definitely something else. But nevertheless, it is a rock band, the whole attitude, the whole image, the whole everything. So rock is not
Probably influenced by Brigada S to a large degree.
Yes, yes, and that is why I was at Неприкасаемы's 10 years anniversary in 2005. I happened to be there at Олимпийский in Moscow, and Shnur was one of the guests, one of the VIP guests. So yeah. Rock music is definitely not dead, but now it's, I don't know, it almost seems like it just took its proper niche in mainstream and became appropriated, I guess. I don't know. This is definitely something to think about, and thank you for this question.
Thank you for that.
My question is sort of a follow-up to his, is that it seemed to me, or sort of answering the question as well, it seemed to me that the need for rock continued into the early 90s, because after Musikalny disappeared from TV, you had a program like Our Studio on the second channel, which was a much more freer format, where you had many of these same bands and slightly younger bands playing live. And then that somehow was just sort of, it seemed to me that it was a kind of decision made by the TV executives to sort of disappear rock music from the airwaves, because there are lots of decent bands, but they're not present as part of mainstream culture. Whereas up to like something like 1995, there was this kind of niche for that, you know, that there was a kind of inertia that carried over from the 80s.
I think, I honestly don't believe it was up to some decisions made on the higher ups, like some sort of like unofficial state, government decision or something. I don't think so, honestly. I still think that the most important thing was money back in the early 90s. It was newly establishing capitalism in Russia, and they would just simply go for the acts that had more potential in the commercial terms from their standpoint, from like radio or television standpoint. And there were thousands of at least hundreds, maybe not thousands, of new pop projects popping up back then, and they probably saw them as having more potential to make money. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, the new radio station was established, the one that I mentioned in this presentation, Nasha Radio, whose main slogan became, I don't know whether they did it intentionally, I have no knowledge, I need to explore that, but I think they did borrow it from Tsentr, все наше навсегда. And the idea was to start really making money on rock. That was the time when they started repackaging and releasing the remastered compilations of the 80s heroes. And what they did roughly was they would take the more radio-friendly songs by these bands, in their opinion, and they would make them, they would play them on the airwaves, and they would promote this new sound, old new sound, and what happened was that a lot of young bands were influenced by that because they knew that now they could make money on it, and good money too. So they started producing, they started making music which sounded like polished, radio-friendly Russian rock. And according to many, and I share this opinion, that was the end of it. That was it. That was when a Russian rock music died in the form as we knew it back in the 1980s. And at the same time, it was the time when Russian rock became an established genre. And from that point on, it would be okay if somebody asks, what kind of music do you play? I play Russian rock. You know, instead of I play new wave, or I play rhythm and blues, or I play jazz rock, like it was back in the 80s. So roughly that's what I think about it.
Yeah, except there's the paradox, because most of, well, especially the first set of bands you showed, they were all members of the Leningrad Rock Club.
Yeah.
So in this classical period, when you were presenting them, they had very limited venues in terms of where they could play.
Yes.
They could play at the Rock Club, they could play at the Rock Club Festival, which was at the Leningrad Youth Palace, and they could play illegal concerts in people's houses and stuff.
Kvartirniki, yes,
Yeah.
another interesting phenomenon.
Whereas already in the 90s, you actually have you have a real club movement
Yeah.
starting, where there's lots of clubs, and in fact one of the best early clubs in Petersburg was started by Sevagakal, the cellist from Aquarium,
Tam Tam.
which was a fabulous club that didn't last very long, but it was like everybody wanted to play there, and many bands of the next generation got their start there. So it's a kind of paradox. It became easier to find venues to play, and you didn't have to ask anyone's permission, and you didn't have to belong to the Leningrad Rock Club.
There's definitely a paradox, and as I said, I don't think, I'm not saying it wasn't the case, as I don't know, but I don't think it was an official decision. I think it's just the way things worked, unfortunately. The Soviet Union collapsed, the capitalism was, well, the idea of democracy wasn't achieved, but it seemed to be, the country seemed to be on its way to achieving it. And maybe some people just saw that there's nothing else to protest against. I don't know, probably that's how it happened.
That brings up the interesting idea that rock is inherently tied to protest and politics as opposed to just an art form. But what was I was wondering about during your lecture, we heard about the ones who were subversive. We also heard about KGB observation and accusation about CIA manipulation. Was there any music on the other side of it, nationalist music? I know the Luber movement then was sort of a parallel to our skinheads here. They had music, but I don't know, what did those guys listen to? Would
Nationalists?
Rock would be too Western, right? So did they have their own music?
That's a good question. Well, they still listen to the heavier rock, to the best of my knowledge. And unfortunately, one of my favorite bands from the 80s, Alisa, that I started this presentation with, is, to the best of my knowledge, one of the Russian nationalists' favorites today, especially given Kinchev's current stance. Любая, of course, Любая.
And also Гражданская оборона appeals to
Well,
certain kind of...
you can start originally the more conservative circles of Soviet youth, strangely enough, enjoyed listening to Viat. Sort of a Soviet official answer to Western rock and pop music was this so-called вокально-инструментальные ансамбли, vocal instrumental ensembles, which were basically bastardized versions of pop rock from in the 70s, and that carried over to the more conservative youth circles in the 80s as well, until they got their own sort of trumpeteers in Lyubę. And with Kinchev, he's an odd case in all sense of the word. He was probably the most, well, he went to become probably the most conservative, almost to the point of I guess brown shirts rock musician in the 90s. And but lately he's been kind of keeping it under wraps, oddly enough. First of all, I was expecting him to step out and proclaim Krivnash and all stuff, and somehow he kind of keeps it under wraps. In the last 3 or 4 albums, which I've heard, he doesn't really go as far all out nationalistic as he did in the late 90s and early 2000s. He actually more, I think he's kind of on, I'm being overly optimistic here, but kind of sounds like he's on his way back to sanity.
Okay. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we need to wrap this up as we're out of time. Thank you all very much. Let me just say one more thing about Kinchev, and you mentioned Гражданская оборона. Those are complicated cases. You cannot easily label these people as black and white, and you're right. And if I create an impression that Kinchev is definitely pro-nationalistic, it's more complicated than that. I've read one of his interviews, and he said, he expressed a very well thought out position. He's a nationalist, but not a fascist, let's put it this way. He might be even looked at as a Slavophile, in a sense. But if you say some things about, go Slavic peoples at your concert, and after a concert, somebody just, bits some people from Caucasus, from Georgia or Armenia, who's to blame? I think it's still you, because you cannot expect your audience, especially if you know what kind of audience you have, being as knowledgeable as you are in all this, in terms of all those philosophies and all the culture and history of, philosophical Russian nationalism. Okay, I greatly appreciate you all showing up here today. I hope these 2 hours were not the most boring 2 hours of your life.